I'm Lisa Lewis. Welcome to our Black Health Matters Spring Summit session. Together we can, muting multiple myeloma through community research. Thank you for joining today. I lead our diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials work at Janssen, where we work to make sure that all patients have access to our cancer clinical trials, especially those who are historically underrepresented, underserved, or marginalized. I'll also take a very quick minute to acknowledge Research Includes Me, a platform that shows our commitment to improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials through education, awareness, webinars, community engagement, our website, and other resources. I'm super excited to have the panelists join us today. I'll start by introducing someone who I'm very honored to call a colleague, Dr. Jaszianne Tolbert. Dr. Tolbert is a Senior Director in Oncology Clinical Development at Janssen. Dr. Tolbert is a board-certified pediatric hematology oncology physician, and she's also trained in pediatric clinical pharmacology. Prior to joining Janssen in 2019, Dr. Tolbert was the director of a pediatric early phase clinical trial program. And Dr. Tolbert currently leads multiple clinical trials for Janssen Oncology in the areas of acute myeloid leukemia and multiple myeloma. Dr. Tolbert is also an active member of our Janssen Oncology DEI Council, where she leads multiple initiatives, and she's a leader within our ongoing oncology diversity and clinical trials work streams. Thank you, Dr. Tolbert, for joining us today.
Thank you, Lisa.
I'll also very excited to introduce our multiple myeloma leaders from Mount Sinai, and a hospital is actually near and dear to my heart. I started my cancer research career there over 20 years ago. I'd like to welcome Khalina Herrand. Khalina is a clinical program manager for the Multiple Myeloma Translational Research Program at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai Hospital. Khalina has over 2 decades of nursing leadership experience in various therapeutic areas, including primary care, infectious diseases, and oncology. She is the clinical program manager at the Mount Sinai Brooklyn campus, and her primary role is to make sure that there's touch points with the community, there's outreach to community organizations and partnerships with agencies. Khalina leads educational sessions, and she works very diligently to identify gaps in care within communities of color. Khalina is a family nurse practitioner, board certified, and she's also currently pursuing her doctorate of nursing. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Dr. Cesar Rodriguez Valdes. Dr. Rodriguez Valdes is an associate professor of medicine, hematology, and medical oncology, and the clinical director for the multiple myeloma program at Tisch Cancer Institute of the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Dr. Rodriguez Valdes is an extremely experienced multiple myeloma physician and sees patients at both the Mount Sinai Brooklyn campus and the Ruttenberg Treatment Center. Dr. Rodriguez Valdes completed specialized training in cancer biology and therapeutics at Harvard Medical School, and has extensive expertise in early phase clinical trials. Dr. Rodriguez Valdes is particularly interested in early development drugs and immunotherapy, and serves as a committee leader for immunotherapy for the Multiple Myeloma Clinical Trials Network Intergroup. So we're going to jump right into our discussion today with just some quick background. Dr. Tolbert, can you tell our attendees today, what is multiple myeloma?
Yeah, sure. So I always find it interesting that, when we're in person, you ask the question, like, who's heard of multiple myeloma? That when we go out into the community to talk about it, that not many people have actually heard about it. I tested this on my own family as well as my mom and my aunts, and they hadn't really heard about it. But it's crazy because it's been around for a long time. It's a disease that has been described for quite some time now. And particularly in the Black community, it's important to know about it because African Americans can get this disease almost twice as frequently or even higher than other minorities, other races. So it actually, it's a cancer of the blood cells. And we know that we have red blood cells that help us carry oxygen, the platelets that help our blood to clot. But the multiple myeloma affects the white cells, and particularly a type of B cell called plasma cells. And I feel like now with the COVID pandemic that all of us have become sort of like immunologists in training, learning about antibodies and antigens. And these plasma cells actually help us to produce antibodies that help us to fight off infection. And when the multiple myeloma proteins come in and they affect the cells, it sort of halts that process where your body can fight off infection. Normally when you get multiple myeloma, these cells are affected. They don't get the normal signal to do their normal activity. And so you end up with patients who can get a lot of infections. It also can affect the bone. They get a lot of bone fractures and bone lesions. It affects the kidneys. They can get renal failure. And not only does it affect the white cells, but because these cells are in the bone marrow where the blood is being produced, it can stop you from producing some of the other cells too. So like the red cells, you can get anemia, and then the platelets, and they'll have low platelets and can have a higher potential to have bleeding. So that's a high level kind of overview of what it is. Why it's important is just for those reasons that, we need to let people know about this so that they know what kind of things to look for. And then they know when to seek treatment and guidance.
Thank you, Dr. Tolbert. A very important point. And to piggyback on that, I'll pose this question to you, Dr. Rodriguez Valdes, and also Khalina. Please feel free to chime in as well. Following on to Dr. Tolbert's points, why is multiple myeloma treatment and research important to you and your team at Mount Sinai?
Thanks for the question, Lisa. And this is a good question to ask because, as Dr. Tolbert pointed out, multiple myeloma is a type of cancer that affects the Black community more than any other ethnicity. And in New York, we have a very large community that has either limited access or no access to treatment for multiple myeloma. This is a type of cancer that over the last 15 years, it has really evolved dramatically from being a cancer that would normally kill people within 3 years, and we didn't have that many treatment options, to now a type of cancer that we have up to 19 different therapies that we can use, mixed, combined, that gives us a lot of options and has transformed this cancer into a more chronic disease. But even though we've learned so much in the last 15 years through clinical trials and learning how this cancer affects people and how it actually can be treated better, we're still not having a big impact in terms of curing cancer. We have not been able to cure this cancer with all the therapy that we have. And even more interestingly, we are not making as much headway in the Black community as we are in other ethnicities. And that's where Mount Sinai thinks that it's our opportunity to step in. We are one of the largest hospitals here in New York area, and we have clinics in different boroughs. And by looking at where the areas of least access to multiple myeloma care are, we identified, for example, Brooklyn as being one of the sites where patients that have multiple myeloma have the least access and therefore have the highest risk of dying or not getting proper therapy for multiple myeloma. So we want to do exactly something to help reach out to them, us go to them and offer the clinical trials that we offer uptown, which objective of these trials is to find new therapies that we could potentially be able to identify a therapy that might either be the cure or might be easier to tolerate and more effective.
Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez Valdes. And Khalina, your thoughts?
Sure. Just to add to that, I think, as a multiple myeloma center in Mount Sinai is a center of excellence. It's our responsibility to reach out to the community because, as Dr. Tolbert said, there is, such a knowledge deficit with what is multiple myeloma. So not only do we provide research, we also provide education with platforms like this to our patients and the population at large. So I think it's a responsibility that we don't hold lightly, and we want to make sure we give back to our community.
Thank you for that. We also hear a lot about different types of innovative treatments. We hear a lot about targeted therapy. Dr. Tolbert and Dr. Rodriguez Valdes, can you explain to our attendees what is targeted therapy and how is it different from things like chemotherapy and other types of treatment for cancer?
Yeah, so I think the chemotherapy that most people think of is the traditional chemotherapy where you find out a family member or friend has been diagnosed with cancer, and you're already anticipating, right, that you'll see them get really, really thin, they'll be very frail, they'll lose their hair. And that has been, the issue with past chemotherapies, where we're targeting all of the cells that rapidly divide and are active. And so a lot of those are the cells that affect your hair growth and that line, like the lining of your mouth, and things like that. So they keep you from eating, you lose weight. But now, over the years, what we have been able to do through research, right, and through studying these cancers more intensively, is identify drugs that can target things that are only on the cancer cells and not on other cells in the body. And so when you do that, you're able to effectively kill the cancer cell while trying to do the least harm to the patient as far as side effects. And I don't know if you want to comment on some of the novel therapies that we have, Dr. Rodriguez Valdes.
Yes, you explained it very well. A simple way that I do it when it comes to explaining patients the difference between chemotherapy and targeted therapy is I tell patients to imagine chemotherapy as a dirty bomb or as a shotgun that's gonna try to attack as much as possible and have a lot of collateral damage that we might not necessarily want. And targeted therapy is more like a sniper attack, where you're actually zoning in on one particular thing so that you don't have to have so much affected around it. And there have been a lot of targeted therapies developed since and approved since 2015, I would say, or even a little bit earlier, where the therapies that we're using now target specific proteins that we find in on the surface of the myeloma cell, of the cancer cell. And that way, when we introduce whether infuse or inject or take the medication for myeloma, that goes into a scavenger hunt and will attach to that protein on the surface of the cancer cell. And once it's attached, it's going to trigger either the destruction of the cell, or it's going to help trigger the immune system to go and attack the cell. So we have now targeted therapy that targets protein markers like CD38 or SLAMF7, BCMA. Those are some of the most common protein markers that we are using to use therapy and target those proteins in the cancer cells. And we're still developing and doing clinical trials on many others, like GPRC5D, FCRH5. There's a lot of protein markers that are more commonly found in cancer cells, and those can easily be used to guide therapy and attach to it and help the treatment just focus on those particular cancer cells.
Thank you for that in-depth explanation, Dr. Rodriguez Valdes and Dr. Tolbert. We hear so much about these treatments and therapies. It's good to actually understand how they work. I'll put this next question, and you all touched on it a bit, but I want to dive a little bit deeper into, Khalina, can you just give us an idea or your thoughts on why is it so important for us to make sure that we have community-based research, particularly community clinical trials?
Okay, Lisa. So I think it's extremely important for us to be represented in the research phase of any, of any up and coming medications, whether it's myeloma or any disease that affects within our community. And the only way we can do that, again, is through outreach and education. I think, our community needs to be equipped with facts and so they can make a lot of, clear, sound decisions. So if we're speaking about myeloma, which is predominantly a disease that affects people of color, then they need to be equally represented. We need to be equally represented in the research phase. So that way, when these drugs come out, we can say, with our population, this is, the end results. And it's unfortunate that we are underrepresented within research throughout, not exclusively to multiple myeloma. So again, I think to really make that bridge and fill that gap is going out into the community and explaining the various trials and what clinical trials are, and also dispelling a lot of myths that are out there. I think that's one of the barriers that we have are the myths and answering questions. And I think as providers, there's always an opportunity for education with every interaction that we have with a patient, whether it's in the office, out in the streets, or sometimes, within a text. So I think we really need to make sure we dispense that information out to our community.
Yeah, and I absolutely. Yeah, I was going to just agree with all of that because, you know, Lisa, that I'm very passionate about educating the communities. I think that sometimes, you know, as researchers and maybe people that work in industry and academia, that we don't go out enough and we rely on our own knowledge and experiences to design the clinical trials without necessarily getting that community input that we need. And when we go out into the community, right, we have to make sure that these relationships and these asks are not just transactional things, but that they're reciprocal, right? So you're going and you're asking to be educated by the community. And in addition, you're also educating them. They can give you feedback. There are many people and resources within the community that we turn to. You know, a lot of us turn to our pastors, our priests, our family members, and they can help to guide us on how to best design clinical trials so that we can get more participation. But it can't be a one-way street, right? There has to be some give and take on both sides. I do think that the exposure is what is helpful in getting people to either seek care and then in the learnings that we get from the community and helping us to provide access. So identifying where the deficits are and where the gaps are.
Dr. Tolbert, what do you always say? Meet people.
Meet people where they are. Yeah, you have to meet
Yeah.
people where they are. Yeah, you can't expect everything to come to you. You can't, you know, they can't expect everything to come to them either. And Khalina referenced, you know, addressing some of the barriers. I do think, you know, that as physicians, sometimes we sort of go to that first one, right, when it comes to the Black community about the trust. And while there is still a lack of trust within the community, that's not the one single thing. And when you talk to patients, they're like, no, I would have enrolled on a clinical trial had someone presented it to me. And so, you know, as physicians too, we have to overcome that bias that we have that we don't always, you know, notice when we're speaking to patients. And sometimes we intentionally, you know, avoid patients because we already have in our mindset, oh, this patient will be able to participate because X, Y, and Z. So we have to get over that part too. It's not just trust on the patient end. That's a barrier.
Well, I think also as a provider, is being comfortable with identifying that we have that perceived bias. And I think once we start working with that internal, you know, with our internal issue, then we can, you know, I think also better serve the community and making research just general. Because you're right, not everyone knows about myeloma. Just really fundamentally, what is research, dispelling myths and providing facts. You know, I think that's something that it's crucial.
Yeah.
You bring very good points in terms of the importance of educating the community that clinical trials is not being a guinea pig. Clinical trials is actually trying to get access to the best therapy possible. And not just to help you, but at the same time, you're helping others because you're leaving a little ground or your grain of salt for whoever's coming after you. And making sure not just to educate the community of the importance of participating in a clinical trial to try to understand, include diversity, but and at the same time answer the question, is this drug benefiting all ethnicities? And because right now the majority of the people enrolled in clinical trials are not part of the minority representation. And we just assume that the results are actually going to translate to all races and ethnicities when it's just an assumption. And the other thing is designing studies that, like you mentioned, going to the community, seeing what their needs are, what their limitations are, so that the studies are designed in a way that are not going to limit certain people to participate in the study, not because they don't want to participate, but because it might be too demanding for their day-to-day needs or what they have access to. So there's a lot of variables that we need to keep in mind. And it's not just the patients and it's not just the community, but it's also educating doctors and scientists on how to make studies that are going to be inclusive for everybody.
So many important points: bridging the gap, challenging our assumptions, and that two-way street of trust. It goes, you know, trust goes both ways. Those are such important points. Any final thoughts before we open the floor for Q&A? This is, you know, we wish we could have an hour for this conversation, but as you both said, Dr. Tolbert and Dr. Rodriguez Valdes and Khalina, multiple myeloma is a disease that disproportionately affects the Black community. So Before we open the floor, any final thoughts or calls to action that you would give to folks joining us today?
I like that you said that, because my first thing was going to be, I don't have a thought, but I have a call to action. So my call to action to everyone that's called, right, is if you don't know about the disease, maybe to educate yourself. For those who are providers and researchers who design clinical trials, to go into the communities and try and figure out what some of the needs are. As Lisa says, I like to say, meet people where they are. But also, right, for all of us, is I think when people get a diagnosis of cancer, right, everybody's in shock. And then, like the shock sort of wears off. But it comes to a point where sometimes the patient diagnosed with cancer feels like, whereas before you were living your life and you had a life, now with a cancer diagnosis, you sort of have to earn the rest of your life. And I don't think that should be the case. I think as researchers and community advocates, that we can all work together to make sure that we can come up with the best treatments possible that work for everyone. So there's not a subgroup of people who feel like they're in the fight harder than others who have the same diagnosis, or they have to earn their life and prove themselves, whereas others may not.
I would like to add that one of the take-home messages I would encourage everybody is, regardless of what, when you're seeing a doctor, regardless of what diagnosis you get, whether it's cancer, whether it's multiple myeloma or any other disease, always, there's two things that I think are key. One, when you leave the office, make sure you have tried to answer all of the questions that come up. Don't feel intimidated by being in front of a doctor of whether you can or cannot ask. It's your health, it's your body, it's your life. So be comfortable with the decisions that you're here, that the information that you're getting, and try to understand as much as possible. Ask as many questions as you can to try to understand and assimilate what you're hearing, so that you can actually have a partnership with the doctor and the treating group, because you're going to be working as a team. And then the other thing I would encourage everybody to ask their doctors or the nurses or anybody in healthcare whenever they're getting a diagnosis like multiple myeloma is to ask if there's a clinical trial or a study that they could benefit on. You can hear about it, you can decide to join or not to participate, but it's always, knowledge is power. And the more you know about what's going on with you and the resources and the options that you have, the more comfortable you're going to be with the decisions you make.
I agree. I think to add to that, one thing, I think my golden nugget is, I always tell my patients, before you see any provider, just make a list of questions when you're home. And, some people see commercials for, oh, what drug is that? Oh, just write it down, just a simple little phrase, or text yourself if you're savvy, and just have a list of questions. Because, you ask, and the worst that can happen is the provider might not know, and you can both look it up together. But you definitely come with a list of questions. That way, if you miss anything, you can speak to your provider, and also engage your family, your friends with these lists of questions. Because, as they say, illness is a family affair. So make sure, you have your questions before you see your primary health provider or your oncologist. And it also could include, is there, for this diagnosis, is there any research? Is there, or what medication was this? Or even, I heard this on the news. What does this mean? Or what does that terminology mean? Because we will be more than happy to explain, any questions that you have. And again, like Dr. Rodriguez said, in the PBA and our commercial, knowledge is power.
Definitely, knowledge is power. Great points and calls to action and golden nuggets, as you said, Khalina, for everyone to take away. We have a couple of questions. I'll try to get to them all. The first question, and I'll pose this question to you, Dr. Tolbert. Why is multiple myeloma misdiagnosed or sometimes diagnosed years after it starts to develop?
Oh, that's a good one. So there are actually, what we didn't mention, right? Because we mentioned that we could talk about multiple myeloma for hours. There's actually some what we call pre-cancerous or asymptomatic types of multiple myeloma that people can get before it actually develops into full multiple myeloma. And a lot of times, particularly in African Americans, one of those is they're higher, more likely to get. But it's often not diagnosed. And one of those things being education. If you don't know the symptoms to report or things to look for, then sometimes that's, a later diagnosis. we present for care a lot later. And some of that is access, or, you know, we have jobs, we have things to do that we can't always make it to the doctor every time we have a single complaint. And so, you know, that can lead to later diagnosis. Additionally, though, you know, making sure that the providers that are taking care of the patients in our communities are educated about these things as well. And so they know what to look for. And then I'll let Dr. Rodriguez Valdes add to that as well.
The other things that tend to make the diagnosis a little bit difficult is it tends to affect people in their late 60s or early 70s, and the most common symptoms tend to be fatigue, being tired, having bone pain, back pain, and who doesn't feel tired and have back pain in your 60s or 70s? I'm 43 and I'm having back pain and feel tired all the time. So a lot of the symptoms that are associated to multiple myeloma can easily be masked or confused by regular problems that we have. So a lot of the times when the symptoms happen and we go to see a doctor, they easily can be mistreated because it's not the first thing that comes to mind. So that's where the doctor's knowledge also kicks in making sure that multiple myeloma is in our differential of one of the diagnoses that could be causing the symptoms.
You both, and Dr. Rodriguez Valdes, are there any screening tests for people, particularly those who have a family history of multiple myeloma?
So unfortunately, we don't have any screening tests for multiple myeloma like we would have for breast cancer or lung cancer or colon cancer. There are some studies that we're developing that we're offering them to family members of patients who have multiple myeloma who are above the age of 40, where we do blood tests on a yearly basis to try to see if we can identify any markers or anything that would suggest that there is a trend or a predisposition or a tendency. But these studies are just to gather information, collect data to see if we can actually come up with some screening methods. But at the present time, there are no screening tests. So the best thing I can recommend for people to do is to do your yearly annual exam with your primary care doctor. So they could do a physical exam, they could do blood work, and that's probably going to be the best way to identify red flags early on.
And make sure you tell them your family history too. That's always important.
Correct.
But yeah, they leave that off sometimes.
Right. Also listen to your body. I mean, pain is not normal. I think sometimes we underestimate, you know, it's the body's way of telling you, hey, there's something going on. It's a red flag. So don't dismiss if it's a symptom you feel. Be comfortable and tell your provider about it, whether it's, you know, something that just doesn't feel right. We know our bodies. So if there's anything that's out of the norm, it just doesn't raise uncomfortable, you definitely let your provider know.
Great points. And I always say, as a patient, you have a voice, right? They say the customer is always right in retail. Well, the patient always has a voice. So ask those questions, and knowledge is power, like you all said. We're nearing the end of our time. Thank you so much, Dr. Tolbert, Dr. Rodriguez Valdes, Khalina Herrand. If you have any questions about what you've heard today, please be sure to speak to your primary care physician. And as we mentioned earlier, knowledge is power, and there are a lot of resources out there. And if you have any questions specifically about clinical trials, please visit researchincludesme.com, our platform to show our platform for clinical trial awareness and education. And if you have any questions about the importance of diversity in clinical trials, please visit researchincludesme.com. Also, please visit our researchincludesme.com table on site at Riverside Church today. And again, you are empowered to ask questions and to be active in your care if you ever have a diagnosis, including for multiple myeloma. Any last thoughts before we close?
Enjoy the rest of the day and enjoy the community and the events that are happening today there.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you everyone online. Enjoy the day at the Black Health Matters Spring Health Summit. Thank you everyone.